Omniscient Reader's Viewpoint by Sing Shong. Chapter 119. Abandoned World. Part 4. The King of Wanderers smiled slightly at my words. It has been a long time? I saw you last time. We just passed by each other at the time. So far, I had seen the King of Wanderers twice. The first was when Han Suyang and I destroyed Song Minwo, and the second was when the disaster of floods was killed. This was the third time. The King of Wanderers slowly took off her mask. As expected, it was her face. I asked, "When did you get out?" "A little while ago." We looked at each other for a moment. My mother and I didn't look alike. No matter how hard I looked, it was only a face in the late 30s. When I was a child, I often heard that she looked like my older cousin. Of course, that was when I still had my father. "Did you live in Seoul?" She replied, "I came to meet someone I knew." "Then you were accidentally caught in the Seoul Dome?" "Yes. You have been released. Why are you wearing the prison uniform?" "Let's see. Perhaps it is out of a desire for atonement?" "Atonement? You?" "Every human is a prisoner. They have their own prison." I stared at my mother. That shameless tone. She really hadn't changed. She told me, "Can't you say any words of thanks? You would have had a harder time without me." Certainly, she helped. My mother led her forces north to the disaster. It was great, no matter how weak the disaster. In fact, I believed that she would do it properly. I hated my mother, but I also knew my mother well. "You are meeting your mother, but you don't seem happy. Do you really want that?" "A little bit." The exclusive skill lie detection LV1 is activated. You have confirmed that the statement is false. How funny. I knew it was a lie, but I still had to check. I said, "You have survived. You are a great survivor. It is thanks to the story you told me." "I guess so. You are the only one who came to the prison to see me and told me about the novel you read." That was correct. I never had a proper conversation with my mother during all the times I visited her at the prison. I only talked about ways of survival. Once I became tired of it, I stopped visiting. I didn't have anything else to say apart from the novel. How can that be? The novel was all I had. An image of the past came to mind before disappearing. If there hadn't been ways of survival or the author who wrote the story, perhaps I wouldn't be in this world right now. This story was the only comfort to the Kim Dokja who didn't have a mother or a father. My mother muttered, "It is at most a fantasy novel. In the end, you survived thanks to that novel." We stared silently at each other for a moment. The constellation Prisoner of the Golden Headband is looking at you with excited eyes. The constellation Secretive Plotter is looking at you with strange eyes. The constellation Demon-like Judge of Fire is watching you with sad eyes. I was the one who broke the silence first. "What attributes did you get?" "It might be related to the novel I told you." "Should I tell you?" "Yes, if you still think of me as your child." "I wonder if you think of me as your mother." "A little bit." The character Lee Suk-young has used lie detection LV1. Lee Suk-young has confirmed that the statement is false. Damn it. My mother already had this skill. There was a hint of sorrow in my mother's expression. I had no way of knowing if it was acting or not. She asked, "Are you still holding a grudge against me?" "I'm not here to talk about that. Your father was the bad guy." "I know. There were certainly bad people in this world. One type used violence against their wives, illegally gambled and threatened their family's livelihood. My father was a bad person. I knew it, my mother knew it, and South Korea's laws said it. However, your actions weren't right just because my father was a bad person. There are things we have to sacrifice for a better life. There is no such law in South Korea. There is a law that any human who commits murder should go to prison. You are good at speaking because you only read novels. For me, reality was more like a novel. Because of you. At this point, it already wasn't a normal conversation between mother and son. This was why I didn't want to talk to her. I knew what would happen when we talked. We knew too much about how to hurt each other. I changed the topic. Do you know why I am looking for you? Let's see. I can tell when you are lying, so stop beating around the bush. My mother smiled lightly. You have prisoner number 406? Lend the grandmother to me. Wouldn't it be better to take the incarnation with John Wuchi as a sponsor than this grandmother? I have many useful incarnations. John Wuchi is mother's companion. Besides, the grandmother will be more help. My mother stared at me for a moment before nodding. Certainly, she might be useful because of the opponents. By the way, how do you know the sponsor of number 406? I can't say. Do you have a skill to see sponsors? I couldn't say anything to my mother. Are you going to lend her to me? I'll lend her. Instead. I was a bit afraid of what she would say next. My mother would probably suggest a deal I couldn't imagine at all. She said with a faint smile, next time, introduce me to your friends. I was stunned and couldn't pick my next words. Shit. It was a perfect blow. My mother was the best at making bad people worse. Dokja. Look straight at reality. Even if fiction becomes reality, you shouldn't think of fiction as reality. The exclusive skill, fourth wall, is shaking violently. I only heard a few words, but my entire world seemed to shake. I knew for sure. To this person was the strongest reminder of the reality I hated. Do you understand? The stigma self-rationalization LV1 is activated. Disgusting. Now she wanted to act like a mother. Too many rivers had been crossed to go back now. The exclusive skill, fourth wall shaking, has subsided. I couldn't bear it anymore and stood up. That's right. I think that fiction is like reality. Why? It is because I have always been living that way. Maybe it seems pathetic to you. However, know this. At least I didn't sell reality as fiction like you did. I left the tent with these last words. Cool air entered my coat's collar and reached my body. I looked in front of me and saw the slightly startled Yusenga. I am sorry. Dokja says I was late. It was difficult. No, rather than difficult. It was shameful. Did you hear everything? Yusenga bowed her head in a deep apology. The crown of her head could be seen. I eventually sighed. Would you like to take a walk? We walked along the platform of Yongsan Station. It was definitely a cold wind, but the temperature changed when it touched my cheeks. There wasn't time to wash my hair, but a nice fragrance floated from Yusenga's hair. I asked, how is your hangover? It's okay. By the way, I heard that you carried me on your back. I'm sorry. I troubled you. It was because you were looking after me. We were silent for a moment before I opened my mouth. Do you think it is strange? Why are a mother and son talking like that? That's not true. She was lying. It was extremely strange. Do you want to know? Yusenga's eyes shook for a moment. If you don't mind. I smiled bitterly. Yes, now was the time to talk. I took a deep breath before saying with exaggerated tone. My mother killed my father. Strangely, my words sounded ridiculous. I spoke like it was someone else's story. She went to prison for her sin. I continued speaking. My father, it is shameful to say this, but he is someone meant to die. Domestic violence, gambling, guarantor, my mother and I lived in fear every day. There wasn't a single day without bruises. I was sometimes hit. Then one day, my mother made up her mind and it happened. I thought it was quite well known at the company. Yusenga says I didn't know? There was no answer from Yusenga. She realized with the benefit of hindsight that she had touched a wound she shouldn't have touched. Do you feel even stranger now? It is legally wrong, but you don't understand why I hate my mother. No. I'm not Dr. SSI, so I don't fully understand. Honestly, do you think I should forgive her? Yusenga couldn't say anything. It couldn't be helped. The touched wound had already burst. There was an awkward silence before I spoke again. Do you know the book called The Underground Killer? It was previously on the Kyobo bestsellers list. Talk about a book emerged all of a sudden. Yusenga thought the previous topic was closed and replied awkwardly, I think I've heard of it. Wasn't it an amazing bestseller? It was an essay written by an abused woman in prison after she killed her husband. It was praised by critics at the time. They said that a Korean version of Notes from Underground had come out. Of course, it was completely overrated. Yusenga's face suddenly darkened. She had noticed. I hadn't changed the topic at all. That's right. My mother wrote it. Yusenga's lips dropped open. I still remember the time a bunch of reporters waited in front of my house. They kept asking me if the essay was real. I remember everything my classmates said. They told me that my mother made money by selling murder. Dr. SSI. My relatives also said this. My mother is a murderer. How dare she slip her face into the newspapers? Yusenga wanted to say something, but I kept going. It was a bit hard because of this. No, it was hard for a long time. I could bear to be the child of a murderer. However, it is different to be sold as a story. It is a different matter when my life was turned into money by someone. I looked at the sky. It wasn't night, but I was more certain than ever that the distant constellations were watching me. Perhaps this story was meant for them as well. However, no constellation sent me coins. Should I be glad? I didn't know. Do you still think that I should forgive my mother? I didn't want an answer. I didn't want her to understand in the first place. Maybe this was the ugliest form of violence I could do against Yusenga, who grew up in a well-off family. It was an arbitrary display of unhappiness forced onto someone who would never understand. The kind Yusenga would grieve, knowing that it was impossible for her to understand. I laughed at the unknown sense of victory. I'm sorry. It was a joke. Huh? It was a lie. Were you fooled? Do you think there is a novel like this? My mother and I are ordinary people, and my father was in an accident when I was young. Then something small and soft gripped my hand. The texture was so warm that I forgot what I was about to say. For a while, I stopped walking. Yusenga wasn't looking at me. Thus, I wasn't looking at her either. We walked hand in hand without facing each other. It was as if this alone was sufficient. Strangely, my heart gradually calmed. The exclusive skill, fourth wall, is shaking faintly. Perhaps it was due to the realistic body temperature. Dr. SSI. We neared the entrance of the station, and there was the sound of people rushing forward. We reflexively let go of our hands. Young Hee-won ran over and asked, Did the two of you kiss again? K-kiss? Yusenga SSI is blushing. You did it, you did it. I would have misunderstood if I didn't know Yusenga a bit more. Stop playing around. Nothing happened. Yes, I'm sure. Young Hee-won looked at me and said, A strange grandmother came to find us. She was called by Dr. SSI? An old woman with a cane walked out from the back of the party. I hope this useless old body will be of help. Like other prisoners, the grandmother was wearing a blue prison uniform. She was prisoner number 406. My mother acted very quickly. Are you Kim Dokja? Yes, that's me. I've heard a lot about you from Sukyung. It is a pleasure. It is also a pleasure. Sukyung was my mother's name. I looked around at the party members and said, She is indeed the person I called. Let's depart. We exited Yongsan Station and went to a place where people were gathered. Yu Jong-hyuk's party and the kings were already gathered there. A white crystal slowly fell from the great hall in the sky. It was a crystal that shone with light. Warp crystal. This was the item we would use to go to the next scenario area. Chapter 120. Abandoned World. Part 5. There were exactly 5 grooves in the crystal. Yu Jonghyuk and I were well aware of what to place there. Yu Jonghyuk stood next to me and said, "You came." "Yes. Unfortunately. It doesn't matter if you sit this one out." I turned towards Yu Jonghyuk at the unexpected words. This guy was still talking without looking at me. "You have a woman you love." "What?" "It'll be hard." It felt like I understood something that couldn't be resolved. Perhaps he didn't want to take me to the scenario out of care towards me? It was ridiculous. "Yu Jonghyuk? It could be the last time." I shook my head. It wasn't necessarily impossible when I thought about it. Yu Jonghyuk had lost Lee Seolwa in the second regression. It wasn't an exaggeration to say that Yu Jonghyuk was arguably the world's greatest authority when it came to losing a loved one. I told him, "It's not like that." "Do you think my face is full of love?" I didn't mean it, but the words sounded like self-deprecation. "Let me say this first. I have a decent face." Yu Jonghyuk stared at me quietly and said, "Certainly, I don't care if you die." "Shit. Your words are too harsh." "I'm hurt. Don't forget I still have 1 hit left." "Ah, yes. I had almost forgotten. Thanks for reminding me. I didn't know if this bastard wanted me to live or to die." I communicated directly to my companions through the group chat. "I will inform you of the precautions now." Using the group chat meant that things should be kept secret. The party members focused on my story while pretending to be quiet. The warp crystal transports 2 people together. That's why we will move in pairs, like I mentioned before. Yusung will be with me as Team 1, Hyun SSI and Hyunsung SSI will be Team 2, Yusenga SSI and number 406 will be Team 3. Gilyoung doesn't have a partner, so he will go with Yu Jonghyuk's group. That Yu Jonghyuk, he can take care of himself. You might become dizzy when moving through the crystal. Please don't panic. The scenario will start as soon as you arrive. Keep in mind that once the scenario contents open. I was rapidly pouring out words when the Dakibi appeared on top of the warp crystal. "Wait a minute. I'm really sorry, but I have an emergency announcement." "Emergency announcement?" "I forgot to mention that the number of people who can participate from Seoul Dome is 8, not 10. "What are you suddenly saying?" "All the participants were fixed." Looking closer, this was the Dakibi who asked me about how to update the scenario in the underworld. Was he called Yunki? This scenario, there are those who have already gone to the 6th scenario due to the dimension warping in the 5th scenario becoming twisted. There are already people? Yes, Seoul Dome already has 2 people in the scenario. That reminded me, Han Sooyoung and Gong Pildu were already in the scenario. I saw them on the screen in the underworld but had forgotten for a moment. By the way, part of the dimension warped. It seemed that the intermediate Dakibi had intervened quite a bit in the scenario to kill me. It might be a scenario error, but I am removing 2 of the existing spots for fairness. What? You can't do that. Then who the hell is going? The people who weren't even going were the most upset. The party members looked at me with troubled expressions. Even Yu Jonghyuk was watching me. It was an expression that told me to make the decisions. Damn. Unexpectedly, the first one to raise her hand was Yusenga. "I'll stay back." She noticed my difficulty and decided to be considerate first. I had to take that grandmother, even if I lost Yusenga. Next, it was Young Hee-won who raised her hand. "I will also stay back." Isn't there a secondary allocation anyway? Is it okay? Doc JSSI looks worried today, but don't you know? This time that scary person is on the same side. Certainly, it was reassuring if Young Hee-won and Yusenga were left behind. They would be able to make it into the second allocation, even if there was a lot of competition. In the end, the 2 people dropped out and Lee Hyunsung paired up with the grandmother. The grandmother looked somewhat happy. Just before we left, I whispered to Usanga. I forgot to say this, but tell the King of Wanderers to be wary of John Ildo. I think you already know why. Usanga nodded and hesitated before whispering to me. Don't die. I nodded. Then Young Hee-won asked, aren't you departing now? I'm not a constellation, but they must be impatient. Usanga blushed and retreated while my party and I approached the warp crystal. I pulled out everything that I acquired from the disasters. The protection symbol of the Immuntar. Protection symbol of the parasites. The protection symbol of the Genibal. Then Yu Jonghyuk and number 406 pulled out one each. They were protection symbols obtained from defeating the disaster of ice and disaster of water. Insert the 5 protection symbols. The message flowed from the warp crystal and we placed them in the grooves. There were 5 protection symbols. It was proof that this world was protected from the disasters. Only those who survived the disasters were qualified to go to other worlds. The qualifications are complete. The warp crystal is activated. The crystal split into 4 pieces and a blue-colored door was created. We entered in pairs. Shin Yu-sung and I held each other firmly and moved through the door. The main scenario has been updated. I opened my eyes and Shin Yu-sung and I were in a green forest. We stumbled and felt the clay texture of the soil. I was dizzy enough to vomit. I told the party members not to panic, but it was funny that I was the only feeling dizzy. I looked around and saw that Shin Yu-sung was in the midst of vomiting. Are you okay? Ugh. I patted Shin Yu-sung's back and looked around. My mind was confused, but I couldn't stay in this chaotic state. I looked in front of me, behind me, and to the side. Only the forest was visible. We were in the middle of the forest. It was a scenery that was too similar to Earth. The main scenario, Abandoned World, has begun. The scenario message rose straight away. However, I couldn't afford to check the details of the main scenario right now. I could already feel killing intent from the nearby bushes. Yu-sung. Shin Yu-sung came to her senses and raised her head. Rustling sounds came from the bushes. This was one of the places where new scenario entrants were warped to. If I assumed the worst, those in the bushes were the incarnations of other countries that arrived in advance. I nervously prepared to use the bookmark skill. Maybe those who warped to this world were the elite among the elites. If I didn't do my best in the beginning, my head could fly in the blink of an eye. However, the thing that emerged from the bushes wasn't what I expected. The 7th grade monster, Steel Wolf, has appeared. The same expression appeared on Shin Yu-sung's face when I heard she was a 7th grade monster. It was funny. We were probably the only ones who would be relieved by this message. I think they are quite small, Ajushi. Given the fact that typical monsters were the size of a house, the current steel wolves were the size of ordinary wolves. There were approximately 10 of them. It wasn't a difficult number to deal with. The character Shin Yu-sung has used Advanced Diverse Communication LV3. Shin Yu-sung used Advanced Diverse Communication to make the monsters fight each other. Those Shin Yu-sung failed to tame were killed by the Blade of Faith. The 7th grade monsters were unbelievably fragile. It seemed that their strength was reduced as their size became smaller. Shin Yu-sung wondered, There are no coins? The event is over. There aren't even any items. There are no cores. There is a lot of difference in stats. Are they really 7th grade monsters? They seem more like 9th grade. Shin Yu-sung looked a bit lost. It was probably because the first monsters she met after being so tense were weak. That reminded me, the condition of the forest was a bit strange. This type of forest would normally have trees that rose far above my head. However, these trees were only a little bit taller than my head. The contents of the scenario were still a mystery. There was only the title Abandoned World, while everything else were still filled with question marks. The scenario activation conditions haven't been met yet. I jumped up a bit and looked around. Fortunately, the height of the trees were low, so I could see the scenery of the surrounding area just by jumping lightly. It isn't all a forest. Let's go over there. In fact, I knew what to expect if I left this zone. We moved along a forest path. Not long afterwards, the forest ended and a plains appeared. On the plains. A juicy? We faced a group of soldiers. They appeared. It really is a scenario. Someone shouted at us. It sounded like Korean, even if it was an alien language. The confused Shin Yusung stepped towards me. Hundreds of troops were filling the vast plains. There were dozens of cavalry and hundreds of archers. In addition, there were hundreds of infantry. There were enough people for a war waiting for us here. Everybody prepare their skills. Prepare to advance. Numerous people pointed spears and lances at us. We didn't do anything but were seen as enemies. Attack. It would obviously be an overwhelming sight if it was normal. If only it wasn't for their size. Wayawa. The troops running across the plains were small people the size of my fist. Shin Yusung cried out, "The people are very small. They are the inhabitants of this place. Surely we don't have to fight them." No? Shin Yusung stepped away from the small people who were running. I feel sorry because they are so small. You have met with the people of this world. Check the scenario contents. Then a scream came from the distance. A disaster has appeared on the other side. Quackhack. Our runaway. Full retreat. The small people rushing towards us started running away. It was due to the incarnations killing the small people in the distance. Ha 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 ha. What is this? It is a really easy scenario. It was probably a foreign language being interpreted. There were two samurai wielding swords. They were Japanese. They were playful as they casually cut down the small people like bugs. Shin Yusung watched the ruthless butchery and cried out in a stricken voice. A juicy? What is this scenario? What should we do? I knew why Yu Jonghyuk didn't want to bring Shin Yusung. If I thought about it, he might be more humane than me. It isn't just our planet that runs scenarios in the star stream. I pointed to the small people fleeing the plains. This scenario is a scenario that we share with them. Many of the constellations are hungry for violence and blood. A significant number of constellations are urging you to make a bold choice. The main scenario is activated. Plus. Main scenario number 6, Abandoned World, category, Main. Difficulty, S. Clear conditions, wipe out all dominant species on the number 9871 planetary system, the planet called Peaceland. Time limit, 40 days. Compensation, 200,000 coins? Failure. Plus. In the 6th scenario, we no longer had the role of preventing a disaster. You have become a disaster of the planet Peaceland. In this place, we must be disasters that destroyed this world.